months into the COVID-19 pandemic, America saw one of the largest mass demonstrations in its history after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. These protests are part of an ongoing 400-year conversation on whether or not our country has lived up to the promise laid out in our Constitution, or whether the check has come back insufficient funds. Today we have with us Leon Andrews, the director of the Race, Equity, and Leadership Initiative at the National League of Cities, to speak about what equity really means and what role our towns and cities can take in this equation. We'd like to thank our new premier sponsor at Digital Back Office, Palo Alto Networks. Check them out at digitalbackoffice.com or paloaltonetworks.com, as well as our sponsors at Gateway and Housatonic Community Colleges. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or our member municipal leaders. Leon, thanks for speaking with us today.
Great to be with you, Matt.
So for starters, can you tell us what the REAL initiative is and how it fits into the National League of Cities?
Yeah, REAL. REAL stands for Race, Equity, and Leadership. We were created 6 years ago with the backdrop of Ferguson. I think we all remember where we were 6 years ago when we saw the city kind of facing the tension in their city. And Ferguson actually is a member of the National League of Cities. So they reached out to us looking for help. And
so at that time.
And we weren't doing a whole lot of work at the time around racial equity or racial justice. So the conversations we were having with them, we obviously were saying, don't do what you're doing, the tanks on the streets. Not the best way to respond to the moment. Yeah. But we found ourselves as an organization trying to figure out kind of how do we respond not just to the Fergusons, but there were so many other cities that were facing it, from Baltimore and North Charleston, McKinney, Texas, so many cities. So REAL was birthed out of our CEO and our board president at the time wanting to do more than just put out statements. And so our president at the time was Mayor Chris Coleman from St. Paul, Minnesota, and Clarence Anthony, who was our new CEO at the time, was really trying to organize something that could be more helpful to members. And so REAL was launched with that backdrop to really support how do we strengthen local leaders, their knowledge and capacity to eliminate racial disparities, to heal racial tensions, and build more equitable communities.
To avoid becoming the next Ferguson, essentially.
Yeah, like as essentially, how do elected leaders become more comfortable talking about race and racial equity? What does it mean to lead in this space? It's not what we found 6 years ago. In the journey that we've been on, there's a lot of space that we need to create to help leaders get training in that space, where they can learn and talk to each other, and how do we create more networking opportunities for them to be comfortable leading in the space. But then also, what does it mean to lead? What does actual leadership look like if you're going to be committed to centering racial equity? How do you do business differently within your city?
This is the goal. How do you go about that as a local leader? Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
So I think in this conversation, it's important. Definitions are important. They help us talk about some difficult topics, and they're evolving all the time. So what some people have an understanding from the movements in the 60s, whatever, some of the terms have changed. So how would you define some basic terms like equity and equality, and racism and structural racism, and why is it important to differentiate between some of those terms?
Yeah, I mean, those are really important, pertinent terms to define, and we'll try to jump into it. I mean, I think the equity and equality piece is one that I think is so important to understand at kind of as a foundational level. People tend to use those words interchangeably, and they're not
really not. Yeah,
they're not the same. Yeah, so when I think about equity versus equality, the equity just on a very high level, equality means the same, giving everyone the same. Equity means fair, giving people what they need. And so there's a lot of questions of, well, does everyone need the same thing when we are talking about equity, when we're talking about the work that needs to happen in local government? And so there's this wonderful image. I'm not sure your audience has seen it. If you've been in this space, there's like 3 people behind a fence trying to watch a game. and you give them all the same thing as they're trying to watch the game from behind the fence.
Yeah.
But they all don't need the same thing to watch the game from behind the fence. So equality is giving them all the same thing. Equity is asking, what do they need to watch the game from behind the fence? And
so the short kid needs a taller box.
Yeah. So someone is in a wheelchair and needs a ramp, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do you think differently about just understanding the differences between the two? But while it's important to understand it at that level, it's really simple, Matt, to kind of talk about at that level. I also want people to know equity is much more complicated than that, right? So it's important if people don't use the words interchangeably, equality and equity, but when you start talking about equity in that same diagram of those three people behind the fence, the question will be, why are they behind the fence? How come they're not in the stands? How come they're not playing in the game? How come they don't own the team, right? There are lots of kind of equity questions that we really want people, as you start to understand equity, to understand it's more complicated than just three people behind the fence trying to watch the game. But and at a very foundational level, what I do hope is that people do walk away realizing that equity and equality are two separate words, right? And I think that I think is really important. And then you asked about racism
versus structural
and institutional racism, and that's a really really important term to really unpack. The way we talk about racism for city leaders is to understand it from a policy perspective, policies, practices, procedures. And most of the time, people tend to think of racism as individual acts of racism. So Dylan Roof, everyone remembers Dylan Roof in Charleston. 6 years ago, walks into a church and murders 9 people, and that was an individual racist act. Or Charlottesville 3 years ago, right, in terms of what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so that's usually how people begin to process racism in the individual act. But when you ask about institutional racism is actually looking at policies, practices, procedures that have actually benefited white people over people of color. Sometimes intentionally or inadvertently, but sometimes actually very intentionally.
Yeah.
So for instance, when you say policies, practices, procedures that have benefited white people over communities of color, one thing that we bring up in our trainings a lot for city leaders is to talk about redlining. And so there's a lot of local leaders have heard of redlining before, but not really truly understood the impact of redlining. And as we looked at redlining, knowing that there was intentional policy that was created after World War II that created opportunities for predominantly white families to be able to move out into the suburbs and created the suburbs. 98% of all loans that were granted to families that were returning from the war were given to white families to be able to get access to where they generated wealth. And so that talking about that one policy is institutional racism. So so acknowledging that redlining happened, but redlining is not the only thing that has happened, right? If we look at our transportation policies, we look at our education policies, we look at our criminal justice system, as we look at all of our governmental institutions, policies, practices, and procedures have been designed to benefit white people over people of color. And that is what structural racism is. So structural racism is acknowledging that it's happened beyond just one institution. It has happened beyond just our housing or just education. It's in all of our institutions, which is what structural racism is.
The last few months have taught us something. It's that people tend to choose to have these conversations close to home. They want to know what their local leaders are doing about it. What role can towns and cities play in fostering the ability to have difficult conversations?
It's a great question. I think I think one powerful way local leaders in smaller towns and villages are modeling it is creating spaces to talk, to listen to the community. Having these, what they call uncomfortable, difficult conversations. Creating the spaces for that listening can be one of the hardest things to do. And so I think about one of our mayors that's very active in our work from St. Louis Park, Minnesota, Mayor Jake Spano, white mayor, in a city that is 85% white. And Jake would say, and as he says often, he's like, white people need to know how to talk to other white people about race. And even though he's in a city that is predominantly white, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be having these conversations. In fact, we need to be having these conversations, right? And so he has been very intentional about creating spaces for those dialogues, a powerful voice and advocate. But then he also is acknowledging the work that you need to do, even as leaders, of how do you grow and learn in the space? What are the things that you're doing to really strengthen your understanding? Where training can be helpful, but things you could be reading, books that could be helpful to read, great podcasts that are out there that are really good documentaries that are out there. But that creating space is one that's really, really important. And so I didn't want to just say listen or just without acknowledging the work that goes into it. The listening obviously is not enough as a leader, right? And most leaders know that if you're going to create the space in your community, you're creating the space for the listening because you want to create the space for healing. But you also, if you're as a government, what can you do to also commit to structural changes? And is there something that, part of what you're going into this space, acknowledging that we've designed a system that has not benefited everyone that we serve. And we want to commit to both acknowledging that system has existed where it has not benefited everyone. And we also are committing to trying to figure out the changes that we need to make so it does benefit everybody. And you have to be able to come with that message for it to be, for people to hear the authenticity of it. And also to feel that it's more than just them coming to talk and to share. That you as a community are committed to the structural changes that need to happen, so government can be able to better serve all of its people.
I think it is important for local leaders to go beyond just the simple training or the listening, to expand their understanding of these things. To lead, to be a positive voice on some of these things, and to serve their community.
And messengers, and what's really powerful, to be honest, is just the power of multiple messengers in this space. It's been amazing to see in the last 6 years, just how diverse the messengers are across the country, of cities of all sizes. We're not just seeing leaders from larger cities, but as I mentioned, Jake, but I could mention Adam Chapdelaine, a smaller city in Massachusetts, Arlington, Massachusetts, to Park Forest, Illinois, to there's small cities and villages where leadership is coming, and it's coming from diverse message voices. So white mayors, mayors of color, council members, managers, and so I think that, for me, is what feels probably the biggest difference in the last 6 years, is the foundation of folks that have really stepped in that I don't think I ever would have, to be honest,
pictured 10 years ago or something.
Don't think I would have pictured it 5 years ago when we launched NLC, just like the state league in Connecticut here is, we have a very diverse membership, right? And so and when we say diverse, we definitely have a lot of large cities, but we have most of our members are smaller cities, towns, and villages. And then most demographically, while we represent a lot of our large cities, it's also acknowledging there's a large percentage of white elected officials in our membership. And I don't, do people want to talk about these difficult issues around race? And what I found is that it's quite the opposite. If you create the space for people to have a healthy way of talking about it and thinking about their leadership, people want to lean into the space. And how do you create the space for people to have these light bulb moments that help them understand issues like you were asking, like institutional and structural racism? I got one of the first trainings we did 6 years ago, but it was just amazing to me to watch how, if you create the space for leaders to understand the issue, and it's not intended to attack anyone individually, but it's understanding our history, sitting with the uncomfortableness of it, leaning into it, to be able to say, well, what can I do as a leader to really think differently about the policies, think differently about, my community, and how we are serving it. And there have been so more of those examples that we're seeing over the last 6 years. It just tells us that as you create the space, there's tremendous opportunities for us to really continue to build on the foundation. And by no means do I suggest that there's anyone that's figured it out. I don't want anyone to say, like, if you go to St. Louis Park, Jake has figured out a way to end systemic racism.
It's done, solved.
No, it's not solved, but
Okay.
we have such a great foundation, I think, in
Yeah.
the last 6 years of folks who want to lean into it.
Yeah, I feel like I've felt some of that too, with the kind of the most recent protests after George Floyd and everything.
Yeah.
You know, luckily, Connecticut had lots of protests, but they were all peaceful. We didn't have any issues with any sort of violence or any of that kind of stuff. Despite, in New Haven, they shut down I-95. They
Mm.
marched right down the center of I-95 across Key Bridge and shut down, but it was peaceful. It was, well run. But also in New Haven, we're a college town, so you're a bigger city, you kind of expect that, protests. But then
Yeah.
seeing on the news when some of the small, vastly majority white communities in Connecticut also staging protests.
Yeah.
Like it's seems like it's reached this point where you can't ignore it.
Yeah.
No matter what side of the spectrum you're on, no matter where you're coming from on it, it's something that we have to recognize and address.
Yeah. I think that's right, Matt. I mean, and I think for me, my same observation, I made a very similar observation about where we were after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, versus 6 years ago when I brought up when Real was created with the backdrop of Ferguson. And I do feel like that foundation you're talking about was very tangible, the diversity of protesters and more explicitly, the number of white people who felt that this was personal, this was something that they should care about. And that wasn't just a switch that happened.
Yeah.
I think that story hasn't really been fully reflected, I think, in kind of the amount of work and interest that you're seeing diversity of voices across the country over the last five years. There are groups now of just white people coming together to talk about how do they show up for racial justice. That's a whole national network called Surge, showing up for racial justice. And these are white people across the country that have created the space over the last 5-6 years of chapters of we need to come together to talk to each other. We need to know how to be allies in the space. What does it mean to be an ally in this space as these issues are happening? And I think what you saw what we've been seeing the last couple of months is products of that. It's like this is organizing in ways that that's been happening over the last 5 years, and I think that feels very different. Wherever it goes, you don't know, but it definitely feels different in terms of, to your point, like it's now. Because the fact that it's showing up in these smaller towns and villages, it wasn't like by accident. It's like people have been, some of it is people, I think, having the awareness for the first time, like they should be caring. I think there's definitely a group of folks that are in that, like, wow, let me do some more work. I didn't realize how bad it was. Or what is it that we really need to be tackling? And then there are others that are coming in much more aware and using that as a foundation for helping other people understand how they show up in this space. So I think it's a combination of things. And I think how some leaders find themselves in that space to want to lean in and create the space to continue to grow, I think is the huge opportunity.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH LP 103.5 FM.
One thing that's kind of going to come clear is that this has deep roots in a lot of different arenas that we wouldn't necessarily think about. For instance, we know that race is one of the best predictors of life outcomes in America. What else do we know?
Yeah, no, I think that, that's what you just named there. I want to hope that doesn't get lost in making the point. Like the data does reinforce when we look at from infant mortality to life expectancy, race is still the strongest predictor of one's success in this country.
Yeah, it's numbers. It's there.
It's there, right? So it's like whether you're talking about housing, whether we're talking about health, whether we're talking about education, criminal justice, unemployment, like the coronavirus showed it. Like even as we now look at the heightened unemployment rates, race is still the strongest predictor. Disproportionate number of Black, Indigenous, people of color are the ones that are impacted the most by the high unemployment rates, the deaths in the coronavirus. When we look at the disproportionate number of people that are dying to coronavirus, we know that the data continues to reinforce that Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities are dying at much higher rates. The Center for Disease Control put out a study a couple of years ago looking at the maternal mortality rates of women, and they controlled for everything else in a woman's background. They controlled for how much money she made, controlled for what her education was, where she lived, and they still found that Black women had 2 to 3 times higher rates of maternal mortality than any other racial gender group. So that point that race is still the strongest predictor is really what drives racial equity. We talked earlier about what equity versus equality is, or what institutional versus what institutional racism and structural racism. But racial equity, defining what racial equity is driven by that data. If we know race is still the strongest predictor of one's success in this country, racial equity is closing the gaps where race no longer predicts one's success while improving outcomes for everyone. So that's the definition of racial equity, closing the gaps where race is no longer predicting one's success while improving outcomes for everyone. Both parts of that definition is important. We don't want to see race as the strongest predictor of one's success in this country. But at the same time, we also want to see outcomes improve for everybody. And so racial equity then requires us to be targeted, right? So if we know that race is the strongest predictor, how are we being targeted? And there's a term that Dr. John Powell, for your audience, uses, targeted universalism. Like, how are you being targeted in your process? So you acknowledge we still want universal goals. We still want everyone to be healthy. But so that's that universalism, but we wanted targeted universalism, which is we want to be targeted in our process, but universal in our goals. And that those two pieces is kind of how do you think about the strategies that need to happen to be able to do that. And one of the examples that that I think about to understand that targeted universalism was and it's not directly connected to racial equity, but tied to the Disabilities Act. The American Disabilities Act over 25 years ago, we're celebrating all of the work that went into the success of getting that passed. And for those that remember, that whole movement was to try to create better spaces in our public spaces for people with disabilities to have access to, whether it's elevators with buildings over 3 floors or ramps, or what is called the curb cut effect, curb cuts, right? And so if you think about the curb cuts, for all of our elected officials are so aware, when you build sidewalks, right, we know you need to now have these curb cuts to allow people to be able to, it was designed to be for people with disabilities to be able to better transition from one sidewalk to the next. So that was a targeted strategy for people with disability. But who else benefits from curb cuts? Just about everybody. If you have kids, if you're pushing them in strollers, if you're traveling with a suitcase and you're rolling your suitcase, if you're biking,
grocery basket,
basket, right? So everybody benefited from a targeted strategy, right? And so that's what at the understanding that example in the context of thinking about racial equity is always for me very helpful. While also remembering, because the work I did was childhood obesity work, and I remember the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, for those that have been in this space, they had invested over $500 million to reverse childhood obesity rates by 2016. And so there was all this money that was poured in. I was starting to do a lot of work for the National League of Cities around 2005, 2006, and most elected officials felt like it wasn't their responsibility to do anything around childhood obesity. It was a personal responsibility. Kids needed to stop eating junk food. They needed to stop playing video games. There was a lot of work to really, over those 10, 15 years, to help leaders realize, you can change policy. We have places to create more physical activity, create more recreational opportunities, create better access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Wonderful stuff that was done. Complete streets policy, shared use agreements, land use agreements, all these wonderful things that elected officials started to realize their role in changing those policies. And so we started to see a great movement and great change in cities. And then there was an effort to then start to evaluate, well, is it making any difference? All this work that the local government was doing, are we seeing childhood obesity rates go down? And so they started to evaluate, look at different cities, and guess what they found? As they started to look at for early adolescents, the rates were actually starting to go down. For middle adolescents, it was plateauing, and for late adolescents, it wasn't like spiking as much. And so here we are thinking we did such a great thing, all these wonderful policies, like we did it, we reversed childhood obesity rates, right?
Yeah.
Or at least we're starting to see signs of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then someone asked, after the $500 million were spent, and after we started to see improvement, is it going down for everybody? And guess what they found? For Blacks, it was still spiking. For Latinx, the rates were still spiking. For indigenous populations, it was still spiking.
Mm-hmm.
So we literally could see overall rates go down, but still increase inequities.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was like, wow. And so no one called that out, including myself and all of us in this space, of saying, like, oh, we were thinking about all these wonderful policies, but is it reaching the people who needed it the most? Right? And so for me, just taking those experiences, understanding targeted universalism, realizing what the data is showing us, that race is still the strongest predictor. How do we ensure we're being targeted while we at the same time still want to see outcomes improve for everyone? So it's the hopefully that helps, right, in terms of understanding strategy and what it takes to do the work.
You've heard you talk some before, and you said that the next step is operationalizing. Take what you've learned from these conversations and bring the theory into praxis. Here in Connecticut, we kind of have a case study in this. There's been several towns and cities that have taken the step of declaring racism a public health crisis and recognize the problem as is the first step, I guess. Is that, how do you transition from conversations to action?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, I appreciate you bringing in the operationalizing side, because that is, that's acknowledgement, like, what can we do as city leaders in this space that goes beyond just the talking, as we were saying. And the operationalizing, you really do need to start equipping yourself with learning how to center the work around some kind of tool that helps guide your decision making and your process. And so it's like, once you've done the work of, the ongoing work of normalizing, right? So which is understanding the history, understanding how government has impacted your community. How then do you have a tool that guides your thinking? What are the kinds of what's the space you're creating that allows you to ask kinds of questions like that is centering the voices within the community, centering particularly your Black, your Indigenous, your people of color voices. That helps you better understand, like, are you setting the right results for the kind of goals you want to set for government as you look at your policies? Are you doing the kind of work that helps you understand data? That data piece, and if you're going to really start to operationalize the work around analyzing your data, is going to be so super critical. What data do you have that is disaggregated by race and ethnicity? What data should you be collecting that helps you better understand data that's disaggregated at race and ethnic level? So the analyzing of data is going to be so important, and engaging the community in understanding that data is also super critical, right? How do you continue to center their voices in those conversations that need to happen? As you then start to think about the strategies, like as you start to understand who's benefiting and who's burdening from the policies that you're setting in place. And so the tool walks you through the steps that you should be doing, that's centering the voices of your community, that's being intentional about your data, that's thinking differently about your strategies. And then how then do you think about the implementation of those policies, and how do you communicate that to the community so people know what's different about this policy, that's being intentional about how you're targeting your efforts, or even how you're holding yourself accountable. So those steps are super critical. And I want, hopefully what your audience hears is that the work that it takes to be able to do it doesn't happen overnight. And so it's not as if that if you follow these three things or 5 things, this is exactly how you will make sure you are ending racial inequity in your policy. That's why it's so important that you are grounding yourself consistently in understanding the how to use the tool that's centering the voices of the community.
Another conversation that we're having in Connecticut right now is a legacy of segregation, kind of enforced and unenforced. There's a history like redlining and exclusionary deeds, as we talked a little bit about redlining before. We have a collaborative group here called Desegregate Connecticut, and Desegregate CT, and they come together to look at things like zoning laws and design guidelines. How does the way zoning laws and design guidelines are written create bias in housing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's, I think it's important to know the history of how, well, particularly what's embedded in that question is understanding the history of zoning and housing policy in our country that's
Mhm.
tied to redlining, but it's not only redlining, right? It's understanding how for some cities redlining was not a part of their history, but there
Mhm.
were racial covenants. That was also another part of our history where that there were clear covenants that were made in neighborhoods where they said we didn't want Black people
Mhm.
or people or other people of color living in our neighborhoods. And so neighborhoods were designed not by accident. People ended
Mhm.
up where they ended up, as we understand our full history, but intentionally.
Yeah.
We literally created neighborhoods that said, whites only,
Mhm.
right, in these neighborhoods. And so redlining is a reflection of all of that. And so as you talk about zoning and the decisions that are made, it's with that as the foundation of where neighborhoods are where they are,
Mhm.
and not and how are you then thinking about the decisions now that are compiling on top of that. So
Yeah.
while redlining happened in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, if you look at some of the work that we do right now in cities,
Mhm.
we look at those redlining maps from the 30s, 40s, and 50s,
Yeah.
and then look at your current population, and what you'll find is how closely similar they are,
Yeah.
right? Where those
Those
that
borders kind of lines set up then
yeah,
officially went away, but practically on the ground, they're still there.
that's
The
right.
remnants of them, the scars of them are still all over the map.
That's right on point, Matt. And that goes back to that institutional racism definition you asked earlier of me at the beginning of our conversation. Like these were policies, practices, procedures that were put in place that have benefited white people over people of
Mm.
color, right? That's institutional racism. And it didn't just happen in one institution. And sometimes it did, and even if it happened intentionally in the 30s, 40s, and 50s,
Mhm.
the unintentional aspects of it are happening right now, even if people are not creating policies with the intent of wanting to benefit white people over communities of color.
Mhm.
But because we haven't changed or addressed the history of
Yeah.
policies that still reflect why neighborhoods are the way they are, and how those policies that have been created now continue to reinforce some of those same intentional segregation
Mm.
policies that were in place, only continues to create more problem upon problem, right, that we
Yeah.
have in our cities, right? And so the zoning is one great example of that, right? If we don't recognize that, as we are realizing that these neighborhoods were created the way they were, and now are designing zoning policies that are not acknowledging kind of who benefits and who
Mhm.
burdens by those decisions, we only will be reinforcing the problem
Yeah.
that exists in our cities and in our towns, right? And so the zoning is a great example of the need to understand that history, and the
Mhm.
need now to be targeted as we think differently about our strategies. If you think about how grocery stores or businesses
Mhm.
choose where to build a grocery store,
Mhm.
right? Even before we started taking on these food deserts, which is what it was called, they were looking
Mhm.
at the demographics of a neighborhood. They were looking at the intentionality. They were looking at data of what is considered a healthy neighborhood.
Mhm.
And so a healthy neighborhood was created by some really bad policy,
Mhm.
right? In terms of what we decide was considered healthy, and
Yeah.
or who could live there and who couldn't, right? So these same intentional neighborhoods that were created 60, 80 years ago,
Yeah.
that were exclusionary to Black people and people of color, that then allowed people to be in what they would consider good neighborhoods versus bad neighborhoods, are all part of policies that were then
Mm.
created on top of that. So it's
Yeah.
like, so the policies continue to reinforce the same challenges that cities have never really fully addressed. So we've built some bad policies upon bad policies,
Yeah.
and we haven't really addressed the root cause of the issues, right? Which is the work that in order to be able to do this work,
Mhm.
particularly if we're talking about operationalizing, how do you get to the root causes to really
Yeah.
talk about the work we need to do that really is committed to making sure we're not putting another bad policy on top of something else, right? So that's,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, is really what cities are really trying to do as they're trying to take on this work.
Yeah, when you're talking about the food deserts, I know there's health aspects to that, but one of the other things I was kind of hearing out of that was the business aspect, the economic consequences of segregation.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So to give a big shout out to our colleagues at PolicyLink, they have created this great resource website called the nationalequityatlas.org.
Nationalequityatlas.org.
Yep, nationalequityatlas.org. And actually, if you go there and it allows you to put in your state, you can either put in your city or your region, and it helps you to, what it does is kind of generate research within your city that looks at some data that's disaggregated within your region. So it looks at income and education, and what it does, it makes a business case for racial equity. That's the way I would. It's like, many people think doing racial equity, it's about, it's about the moral thing to do. And there are definitely folks that make the case about racial equity being the moral thing to do. But what I like about this work that we do with city leaders, it's not just about talking about morally, this is a good thing to do. This racial equity is about good governance.
Yeah.
And what I like about being able to be in the data space, it really reinforces that. It makes a business case. And so one of the data sources within the National Equity Atlas, it looks at what inequities would look like within your city if for instance if we continue to see racial gaps in income, and so if you could close the gaps, we're no longer seeing the disparities. That again goes back to closing the gaps where race is no longer predicting one's success while improving outcomes for everyone. If you can close the gaps, if there's an intentionality of saying, we don't want to see these racial gaps in income, your economy would be, what the data shows is just how much larger the economy would be within your region, right? And that's such a powerful way for me to, I think for a leader, particularly if you're trying to communicate to your colleagues about why this is important, that's not the moral thing. Who doesn't want their economy to be much larger if we were to try to figure out how we could be more effective at being able to come up with a strategy to make the economy larger. So I like that from that perspective, but it also helps me think about how you organize, right? Because the third arm of the work is not just operationalizing, but how then do you start organizing this within local government? And so one of the things that I have seen in organizing is that you got to really be mindful that there's so many different groups in organizing. I talk about organizing them into 4 groups. I talk about the group 1 being our advocates. There are folks out there that are always going to be willing to advocate for this work. Whatever percentage, some small percentage, whether it's a mayor or a council member or someone in the community, they're advocates. They're out there.
They're willing to stand up and say,
this is a problem. We need to use our platform to shine a spotlight on it, right? And that's like group 1. Like group 2 is the group I would call the followers. Those are the ones that are, they could be active followers, they could be passive followers, but they're willing to show up. They may not be willing to use their voice, but they might be willing to put the sign in their yard, right? Or they might be willing to attend the meeting, but they're not willing to get on the podium and speak out against it, right? So but they're willing to follow you. So that's like a group 2, right? Group 3 are your skeptics. Those are the ones that, they got lots of questions. They're just skeptical. They could be skeptical positive, open to me, or they could be skeptical negative, but they're just skeptical. Right. And so you have a group of folks that are always kind of in that space. And so that's kind of your third group. And then your fourth group are your resistors. Yeah. The resistors, they could be active resistors, they could be passive resistors. And I think it's important, particularly as city leaders doing this work, to be mindful that you got to organize around all 4 of those groups. And you need a plan and a strategy, because those groups show up on your council, they show up within the city, within city agencies, they show up within your community. And the more effective you are in recognizing a strategy for each 4, it allows you to be more effective in organizing this work. And so the questions that you're asking yourself as you're getting organized is, for those that are my advocates, what's my strategy to help them be more effective as advocates? Yeah. Like, what do I need to do to help them become more effective as advocates? And for my followers, is there a strategy I can put in place to help maybe some of my followers become advocates?
Yeah.
Because they're showing up. They might be passive. Maybe I can get my passive followers to become more active followers. Maybe I get my active followers to become more advocates. Like, what's my strategy, my plan for my followers that helps me build my advocacy base? For my skeptics, what's the work I need to do to help my skeptics maybe become followers? They're open. They just got lots of questions. They might be negative. They might be positive. But how do I help them in a way for them to listen, to be open to becoming a follower, right? And then for my resistors, what do I need to do in that space if they're actively resisting to make them less active, right? And so, the reason why I frame and end in that way is because I think many times people think you need to move your resistors to followers. And that's not the work, right? But I think the work is helping them become less resistant. And what do you do in that space to acknowledge a person's humanity? And I think that's so important, realizing this work. We still need to create the space where we can hear each other. We can affirm each other in doing this work. And it doesn't mean affirming means that I support everything you do, but at least I affirm why you feel the way you feel. And how do you create the space to affirm a person that by doing that actually might make them less resisting, because you've acknowledged who they are and you've acknowledged their voice. And so I just feel like that's also really important in doing this work, particularly as we talk about making the case, because some people will hear it from a business side. When we talk about, again, the dollars and cents, our economy could be much more prosperous if we are centering racial equity. And so you got to think about your different groups as you think about how you message.
Yeah, if you're reaching out to the business community, the economic benefits is going to be should be the top line sort of point you're making to that audience.
Absolutely, that's right. They would hear it a lot differently. Absolutely.
So catering what you're saying to your audience and try to at least make them either less active or, if not, come over to your side so much.
Absolutely, that's right.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of similarities between kind of the campaign to push forward ideas and a campaign for a political candidate. You've got your core base, you got your opponents, but you've got that block of unaffiliated undecideds, and those a lot of times are the ones that they're trying to go and bring over to the side.
No, I think you're right. I mean, if you approach it with from a campaign-like approach, I mean, it does allow you to have maybe even a sense of urgency behind it, right? And that, I think, is also something we have found to be so effective for cities that are doing this work, that, in fact, we tied all three to how we think about our theory of change, of how change happens on the ground. The step one is that folks need to understand why change is needed, right? Why do we need to do something different? And so the work that needs to be done to normalize helping people understand our history, understanding race, and understanding some of the things we've been talking about is really important in helping people understand why change is needed. Then step two to that is, then what can they do? And that's the second part. What are some proposed solutions? What are some tools that they can use? How do you begin to operationalize? And so that's been part of the other thing, part of what we've been talking about as well today. But then three is also that shared sense of urgency. Like we can't wait. Like this is if we don't feel that urgency, we'll find ourselves coming back to this a year from now, 5 years from now, 50 years from now, because we've continued to kick this down the road. And so that urgency, I think, that we're naming right now, I think, is kind of the third piece to and when all three are happening, you'll really start to see the change in your city.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the word urgency. So Martin Luther King Jr. in his "I Have a Dream" speech described this moment as having the fierce urgency of now.
Yeah.
And it seems like 2020 does have that sort of urgency to it. Like we felt certain times past, like the 60s civil rights movement, like there's something in the air. How can we use these moments most effectively to make real the promises of democracy, to see equality and equity?
Yeah, I mean, I think these moments create the opportunity for kind of laying such a strong foundation of us, hopefully creating the opportunities for the kind of change that we want to see. I mean, I think the question, I think, for us in this moment is what will be different, right? As we are, if we are, committed to being, if city leaders are more committed to understanding the data, realizing where the disparities exist, and willing to then, do something different, it will require a commitment to being targeted, targeted in our strategies, targeted in our process, right? And that's where I think city leaders will need to really show, are they willing to step up in how we think differently about targeting our strategies, targeting, where resources are needed. And that requires some political courage, right? We don't want, if we want to continue down this false universalism approach where it is, we will continue to, we know we have this larger problem, but we will just continue to kind of share resources and spread our strategies across in a universal way that's not targeted, we will only continue to see the inequities continue to be exacerbated. And so are we doing anything different that's showing that we're being targeted, that is committed to these kind of structural changes that are needed? And I think that's the opportunity that's in front of us. That will be the measure of, have we done anything different? And where can we point to that shows that commitment has been made in the decisions that we're making?
Yeah. I guess that's in the end, the question is, how do we know if we succeeded?
I feel like in this work, where we started, I feel like there is no one city or one town or one village that has figured this out. And, but if we know that racial equity is about closing the gaps where race no longer predicts one's success while improving outcomes for everyone, that is ultimately the measure if we know we've succeeded. Have we closed the gaps where race is no longer predicting one's success as we're looking at the data and we're seeing outcomes improve for everyone? I think for us in the work that we've seen, commitment level ultimately, is there a commitment across from a city perspective to ensure that everyone is consistently being trained in racial equity? Like what do you need to do if there's work that you're tangibly committed to doing? It's not just a checking the box to say like, oh, we've done one training. Like what's the ongoing work that needs to happen with council, with your elected officials? What's the ongoing work that needs to happen within your city staff, that is really making sure that you are you're establishing such the foundation of who we are. We're changing business as usual. So that commitment to that training across your city, ongoing training, is kind of one example of a model that I think ultimately gets us to building that kind of foundation. That second is that if you're doing that ongoing training, is that you're also then committed to using a racial equity tool in your decision making. It's driving you in how council has conversations, and how staff makes recommendations to council and how they execute. Like you're ensuring that there's a tool that you're having in place that is constantly driving how you're thinking about your process and how you're thinking about your decision making. So that tool, I think, would be kind of a measure that exists, and that's something that's ongoing in your city. And then I think a third would be kind of what structures have you put in place that is holding yourself accountable. And I know it varies by size. Some cities, can have maybe larger structures and capacity. Some smaller cities are still building in some kind of structure, because you're acknowledging how important it is that this is how we function, whether it's hiring a chief equity officer, or having an office of race and social justice, or like where is it housed? How are you holding yourself accountable? How is that resourced as part of who you are as a city? So those for me are like tangible ways. And then I think from an elected official or city's perspective, how are you intentionally using your platform to talk about these issues and to engage your community, and not just the likely voices, but intentionally centering the voices of your Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so how are you doing that in a very tangible way? I think those, if I'm thinking about ways of how, again, this is, I wish I could say this one city has done it exactly this way, but we see elements, right, of cities doing it. You see great examples of cities heading in that direction. But the ultimate measure it goes back to, well, have we closed the gaps? As a result of that, where race is no longer predicting one's success while we're seeing outcomes improve for everybody. And that, I think, is the ultimate measure as a result of all this work, that you want to hold yourself accountable to that outcome.
Yeah. in the face of, the pandemic, and there's protests and kind of everything that's going on right now, and you're going around and speaking to local leaders around the country, are you feeling optimistic about the future?
Yeah, I mean, I do, Matt, and I can't help but reflect on the last 6 years and kind of what I've been able to see in the work we've done with cities across this country. And I always find my way back to the hopeful space. Obviously on any given day, it can be challenging when we see the unfortunate continued tensions that continue to rise in cities.
Mm-hmm.
But there is what gives me hope are the opportunities that we continue to have in the work that we do with cities and city leaders. I definitely am hopeful.
Leon Andrews, Director of the Race, Equity, and Leadership Initiative at the National League of Cities. Thanks so much for talking with us today.
It was great, Matt. Enjoyed talking with you too.
Thanks to our premier sponsor, Digital Back Office Palo Alto Networks, which you can check out at digitalbackoffice.com and paloaltonetworks.com. Also thanks to our sponsors, Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. Learn more at gatewayct.edu and housatonic.edu. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry Draws is on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.